Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Martin Lockstrom, aka Supply Chain Whisperer. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the topic of decoupling. So first of all, before we continue, I think it's important that we really clarify what do we mean with decoupling. And in my view, it basically means the weakening of economic, social, and political ties. And in the context of China, a lot of people basically refer to this as complete severing of ties between China and the rest of the world, which I don't think is a correct use of the term. So rather, I would say that decoupling in this context is more the process of decoupling. We're not really talking about the end state here. So when we talk about decoupling, we basically refer to as the weakening of social, economic, and political ties here. And then the question is, why has this happened? Or why is this happening? And to a large extent, it of course has to do with the Sino-US trade war, which has now been going on for quite a few years already, which has led to countermeasures from the Chinese side with things like dual circulation economy and so on and so forth, which basically refers to China as becoming more self-sufficient and more independent vis-a-vis the rest of the world, primarily the developed part of the world, i.e. Europe and North America primarily. And also another countermeasure is, of course, the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, which also has helped China to diversify its downstream supply chains to the developing part of the world. In other words, decreasing the reliance or the dependency on the developed world as a customer market. So when we talk about decoupling in that sense, from a Western point of view, decoupling primarily refers to China, on the supply side as a source of, supplies where things are being produced. And here, I would say Western companies, they have been rather overexposed to China, over the past 20 years or so. Reason for that being the fact that China currently still is and will continue to remain the number one sourcing and production market in the world for the foreseeable future. There is really no viable alternative to China at this point, and it's unlikely to be differently in the short to medium term. Just a case in point, a city like Dongguan in South China, for instance, has bigger production capacity than all of Vietnam. So I think that speaks for itself, that when companies say that, they're going to move out of China and relocate to Vietnam, we have to take that with a grain of salt. Also, the fact, considering, that the ecosystems that we have here in China today basically have taken decades to build up. So even though you move your production plant to another country, you're still dependent on suppliers located in the vicinity of your previous location. So this is particularly of a concern, of course, in industries like automotive and so on and so forth, which to a large extent depend on just-in-time delivery. In other words, in order to make your supply chain function optimally, it's not enough just to localize your own production plants. You need to localize basically the entire supply chain, the entire ecosystem of suppliers. And that is not a small undertaking. And if that is to happen, we're looking basically, years or even decades into the future before we'll see any traditional shift there. So that's that, from a Western point of view. I think also what's worthwhile mentioning here is the fact that companies very often they say that they pursue global sourcing, which basically means that you know you uh, you source supplies from anywhere in the world, right? Total cost of ownership, calculation dictate, basically where you localize your sourcing and manufacturing activities. And what we've seen over the years is that companies, they have, to a certain extent, they have become over-reliant on China. And there's a good reason for that. Simply, as I said, because China is the biggest sourcing and production market in the world. So basically, you can find everything you need in China, right? So it very much has made sense to localize sourcing and production activities to China. But I think a lot of companies they have not really kept track on how much from a relative point of view activities they have actually localized to China. So when typically when I ask companies, what's your overall percentage of spend localized in China, and the most common answer is well above 90%, something like that. So this of course goes against the general principle of diversification, right? So diversification in this sense basically means don't put all eggs in one basket, right? Because if you drop that basket, then all the eggs will break. So this is exactly the same philosophy that we apply with portfolio theory in finance, right? Where we diversify our portfolio of stocks, right? So ideally, we shouldn't invest all our money into a single stock, but spread the risks across a portfolio of stocks. So yeah, so companies they have generally been overexposed. So now amidst the Sino-US trade war, with a ever increasing number of sanctions coming into place, primarily by the United States against China, and corresponding, quote unquote, retaliations by China. A little bit more covert in nature, though. So as we know, China doesn't, necessarily disclose their future actions to the extent that their Western counterparts do. Also, in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, many companies they realized how exposed they are to China, and especially when it comes to things like medical equipment, pharmaceuticals, like vaccines, protective gear, and so on and so forth, which during certain times are very, very critical in nature. Coming to the conclusion that there needs to be some sort of diversification taking place in the supply chain. So the strategy that Western companies have tried to pursue over the past few years is typically what we refer to as China plus one, which basically means remain in China, but diversify the risks by at least selecting one more sourcing location. Most of the times, this implies countries like Vietnam or Thailand or India or something like that. So I mean, if you're only relying on one sourcing market and you go from one to two, that's a big incremental jump, obviously. So that's what most companies have been pursuing. We hear stories like Apple, for instance. They are expanding their production capacity through their contract manufacturer Foxconn in India. These volumes are still relatively limited, though. I think it's only less than 4% of total Apple production volume. So it's still small, but growing. But as I said earlier, moving a production plant is one thing, but relocating a entire supply chain or an entire ecosystem is a totally different story. It's a multi-year endeavor. also in the context of decoupling, we should also discuss the concept of de-risking, which has kind of overtaken the decoupling term in the mainstream narrative. And reason for that is that the term decoupling can be seen as a little bit offensive or a little bit aggressive, so to say. So by embracing the term de-risking, business leaders and politicians alike, they're trying to, so to say, downplay the impact from the decoupling process. And so in that context, de-risking is basically nothing else, but supply chain diversification. So that itself, the adoption of the term de-risking, it doesn't make term decoupling less real in that sense. I mean, it's a little bit like, putting lipstick on a pig. It's still a pig, right? So I think, that's where we are today. And most likely the current situation will go on for a while. I think geopolitical tensions currently are running high, and there doesn't seem to be much of willingness from either side to really, sit down and trying to find a joint solution here. So, the so-called trade war is likely, to go on, at least in the foreseeable future. So, I mean, the whole reason why the situation is as it is, I think, to a large extent, is rooted, in the fact that the Western thought has always been that, following the narrative put forward by Francis Fukuyama in his book End of History several decades ago, where basically he says that as countries develop and progress, ultimately they will embrace Western style liberal democracy, governance system. And as China now has developed, has evolved, um, it is it has become increasingly clear that this scenario is very unlikely to happen, to the West's high discontent, right? And we also see that, I think the Sino-Western relationship was much easier to manage in the past when there were larger economic differences between the two regions. So, after China's opening up and reform in 1978, China was obviously a very poor country. And from that point and onward, until the 2010s, pretty much, China and the West were very much complementary, right? But as China has evolved, become more wealthy, more prosperous, more technologically advanced, these differences have become smaller and smaller. And today, China is a leader in many areas, especially when it comes to things like, for instance, production of consumer electronics, biotech, genetic research, electric vehicle development and production, and so on and so forth. And when that happens, China is becoming more and more of a competitor, right? China and the West no longer complement one another in the way that they did in the past. So China becoming more of a competitor, and therefore more of a perceived threat to the West. And as the West basically has realized that they cannot really keep up with China's pace. So instead of trying to become better and faster themselves, they instead try to make China slower. And in order to do that, imposing different, sanctions against companies like Huawei, ZTE, for the reason that, these companies somehow happen to be a supplier, to the Chinese military. So if you use that as an argument, then um, why isn't this the other way around? Why doesn't this apply to the West? All the Western companies that supply to, for instance, the US military, which doesn't really have a very strong track record when it comes to preserving peace around the world. I mean, China's military hasn't been involved in any armed conflict for the past decades, at least as far as I know, right? So, as I see it, this argument that, Chinese companies supply to the Chinese military is pretty much, just a smoke screen to slow China down and make sure that, the US and other Western countries preserve their hegemony, basically. Having said that, right now it doesn't seem like any party is interested in, backing down or sitting down around a discussion table and make some serious change. There are some meetings, there are some talks going on, but I think by and large, the overall situation will remain unchanged for the foreseeable future. So in that world, yeah, I mean, what should you do as a company? I mean, you have to make the best out of the situation. You need to mitigate your risks by diversifying your supply chain. So of course, irrespective of the risks that we currently are facing, supply chains should be more diversified than they have been over the past decade. I also think it's important for companies that are here in China. They also need to adapt to the current situation. So when we talk about opportunities and threats in the external environment, so the question is then what is the difference between opportunity and threat? The key difference is basically how you perceive them. So basically, opportunities and threats are changes that happen in the external environment. So if you have the ability to accommodate and to adapt to these changes, then actually what you're facing is opportunity. And if you're unable to, that's when we refer to it as a threat. So in that context, I think it's also interesting to look at, the Chinese word for crisis. It's a Chinese word, 危机. And if you dissect this word into its two constituent characters, wei and ji, it basically mean danger and opportunity. I think with every crisis, there's also a opportunity. All right, that's my rant for today. So thank you very much for tuning in, and see you next time in the next episode. Until then, take care. Bye bye.